Okay, this is Tom Grumbly. It is the 13th of January 2004. This is the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project and the Boulder Carnegie Library Oral History Project. And we are at the offices of Van Ness Feldman Law Firm in Washington, D.C. Tom, why don't we just start by getting a little personal background, where you were born, when you were born, what your parents did, education, that sort of thing.
Well, I was born here in Washington, D.C., which makes me somewhat unusual. October 31st, 1949, I'm a Halloween baby. My parents lived most of their adult lives after World War II here in Washington. I grew up around here, went to school in the Washington, D.C. area, and my father was a lawyer for the Department of Justice, and among other things was responsible for adjudicating a lot of the Japanese claims after World War II. And in fact, there's a small museum after his name down in the Smithsonian at the moment. These were the days when mothers pretty much stayed home, so my mom stayed home and raised myself and my sister, and you know, we lived our lives here in the D.C. area until I went off to college. Went to Cornell, got a bachelor's degree in politics, and then after a couple of years doing economics at the University of Toronto and getting a master's degree in economics, I finished up my education with a master's degree in public policy from the University of California at Berkeley. So that's a thumbnail of my educational background.
How about professionally? What's yours?
Well, professionally, we probably don't have enough time to go into it all, but basically, I did, right out of graduate school, I worked with the White House Office of Management and Budget, where I specialized in research planning in food and agriculture and in the environment. Through that, I met an important person who's been a mentor for me really pretty much in my entire life, Don Kennedy, former president of Stanford and head of the Food and Drug Administration during the Carter administration, and I went to work for him after when President Carter came into office, and then ended up before the Carter administration ended as being the deputy administrator of the Food Safety and Inspection Service at the Department of Agriculture. In the course of doing that job, I met a young congressman from Tennessee by the name of Al Gore. And when the administrations changed in 1980, I went to work for him on the Hill, running his investigations and oversight subcommittee. Did that for a few years. Decided I needed to sample the private sector, having done both the executive branch of the government as well as the Congress, and my wife and I went up to Massachusetts, and I was with a major Massachusetts consulting company, and in the course of that helped to found something called the Health Effects Institute, which is an environmental research institute. That led me to hazardous waste, and then when the Clinton administration came in, I had kept my ties up with Vice President Gore, then Vice President Gore, and he asked me to lead the environmental efforts at the Department of Energy. And that was how I ultimately got into the Rocky Flats experience, while I was first Assistant Secretary for the Environment at the Department of Energy, and then later the Undersecretary of the agency.
Okay. Why don't you tell me about the first time you ever heard about or learned anything about Rocky Flats? There you are.
I think my foot was unfortunately on it.
Yeah, it's fine. It was
at one
fine.
point. Yeah. I think that the first time I heard about Rocky Flats was probably about the day I was confirmed as Assistant Secretary for the Environment, and my staff informed me that quote, Rocky Flats is coming to the environmental program later this year. I didn't know much about that. I quickly found out that Rocky Flats was quite a controversial place, that it had been raided by the FBI in 1989, I think, for a bunch of environmental violations, and that it was a very difficult place to do work. So for the months, between the months of about June '93 and October '93, when the environmental program took the program over from DOE defense programs, I sort of braced myself for what everybody said was going to be a difficult task of managing this place and bringing it from a kind of wartime or post-wartime footing to a footing in which we were going to close it and get out of town.
So your role as Assistant Secretary for the Environment for DOE was
my role,
overseeing cleanup?
Yes,
basically?
yeah, I was responsible for the cleanup of all the DOE sites around the country, including Rocky Flats, but much more expansive than that. Actually, Rocky Flats was maybe the 4th or 5th largest site that we were dealing with. And I was also responsible for the disposition of all of what you might call the loose nuclear materials in the department, not including the actual warheads that the government had, but plutonium, highly enriched uranium, and all kinds of other interesting things that we had around the complex. So it was, and continues to be, for the people who are in it today, continues to be a very challenging assignment.
Was there a plan for Rocky Flats, or when it came into your department, what did you have to do to?
Well, there was a transition plan that was put together for Rocky Flats, but I think, truth be told, on October 1st, 1993, when the status of this plant changed, really the only major change, as I recall, aside from kind of its organizational banner within the Department of Energy, was that we started to recruit for a new site manager to run the place, and began the planning to change the nature of the contract that our contractors had at Rocky Flats. And just to put that into a little bit of perspective, most of the Department of Energy is run by contractors. It's not run by feds. It's overseen by feds, but most of the work is done by contractors, and those contractors work to pretty specific project requirements. And in Rocky Flats' case, as in most of the other sites, they were cost plus award fee contracts, meaning that the companies pretty much recovered all the money that they spent, and then got some kind of an award fee, which would be their profit on top of that. And we felt that that kind of a contract was suitable for the defense sites, but probably wasn't going to be suitable in the long run in order to actually clean up Rocky Flats. We wanted to see it more performance oriented, as the lingo is now, so that the contractors were actually tied to achieving things on the road to cleanup. So I would say the first things we did were to begin planning for the contractual change, start recruiting a site manager, and I mean, we were very concerned about the safety and environmental issues that were at the site, because not only were these issues very significant from the potential to actually hurt people, but also were standing in the way quite greatly in terms of actually getting work done at Rocky Flats.
Because everything had just sort of come to a standstill?
Well, because Rocky Flats, as almost anybody who has any familiarity with it knows, is really kind of like a large factory. with several different buildings, each with different functions, but jammed into a fairly small parcel of land. I mean, Rocky Flats is not like some of the other DOE reservations where they're spread out on literally thousands of acres. I mean, Rocky Flats is in a relatively small contained area because it had been a factory since I think 1947 or very soon after the end of World War II, and because it had been in such intensive operation for many years. There was an awful lot of discarded material that was around the campus, a lot of things that were in storage that were not kept in a particularly orderly way. I mean, to be blunt about it, the place was a mess. Not only from a physical perspective, but from an operations perspective. In order to keep this aging plant going for many years, the department had engaged in many so-called workarounds to the original rules by which the place ran. And as long as the people who were working there were kind of intimately familiar with those rules, they could get work done. But as the workforce aged and new people came into the workforce, as the plant degraded more and more places were contaminated, slowly but surely the place almost came to a halt in terms of its ability to operate, simply because many people perceived, and it was probably true, that the overall work environment was too dangerous to do a lot of work in. So almost the first task in many ways was to try to figure out how to develop an appropriately safe situation in different parts of Rocky Flats. Some parts where the plutonium was held, other parts where there was other kinds of trash, materials, contaminated metal of a variety of different kinds, to figure out how we could sort of get those places into a configuration so that people could actually work. And that was a huge challenge.
So that involved finding a new contractor?
Well, ultimately it involved a new contractor. We inherited the contractor that was working on the site, a company called EG&G, which, as far as I could tell, had been brought in pretty much on an emergency basis after the FBI raid and the previous energy secretary to Secretary O'Leary, for whom I worked, Jim Watkins, was forced really to kind of go out, dismiss, I think, Rockwell, which had been the contract when the raid took place, and bring somebody in. So the EG&G was probably at a disadvantage from the start, in that it was kind of doing this because it was asked to by the previous administration, but they really weren't in position to do the job on a long-term basis, and that became clear as we kind of got into the bidding process.
So were there a number of companies competing for the bid, or?
Yeah, several companies competed to run the site. I can't remember all of them at the moment. We're speaking in 2004, so I think it was about 10 years ago that we started to run that competition. But one very interesting thing happened, and I to this day am not totally sure how this happened. You'd have to ask lots of other people, but the Denver-based company, CH2M Hill, which had quite a good reputation in the environmental cleanup area, decided that it would try to bid this project, and I think as a Colorado firm, some people probably begged it to bid the project, and they teamed up with another company called ICF Kaiser International and formed a separate corporation to work Rocky Flats, and ultimately they were successful. And I would say that the fact that a Colorado and Denver-based company was willing to kind of get into this, while I'm sure many people thought that they were nuts to do it, probably did add over time to the credibility of the contractors at the site, because people who lived in the Denver area knew them, had heard of them, didn't think they were just sort of pirates who were coming in and here today, gone tomorrow. So I think that was significant.
And their contract was structured more along, you said, on a performance
Yeah, it was
basis,
very
so-
clearly, I mean, it was one of the first major government contracts to try to take advantage of some new ideas in government contracting that were being developed at a variety of places, including the John F. Kennedy School of Government, the White House Office of Management and Budget had some people in it when the Clinton administration came in who were committed to trying some new things in the contracting process. The Congress had been insistent that the Department of Energy begin to move away from these cost-plus contracts in which, really there's no incentive for the contractor to save money. I mean, the more money they spend, the more money they make as profit, because the award fees tend to be a percentage of the total money that's spent. So there were a confluence of several events that came together to make us try something that was significantly different. And one was we just had to sort of get this place kick-started and going. I would say also that my own, to the extent that I had any role in it at all, my own experience previously working in the hazardous waste arena, actually cleaning up, working with a company that cleaned up sites, led me to believe that it shouldn't be as difficult or as expensive as the DOE thought it was, and that we could make more progress if we only structured the economics right. And I think in the long run, then there's now been other contracts that have been let there that kind of picked up and pushed further a lot of these concepts to the point where we now have this closure contract for Rocky Flats, which I think almost everybody hopes very much will be successful, and that the bulk of the work at Rocky Flats will be completed by the end of 2006 or approximately then.
And now they're saying 2005. End of 2005.
Well, what I suspect it probably there's probably problems with the definition of what's complete.
Right.
And the department also has an ongoing stewardship function, I think, about whatever residual contamination or radioactivity might still remain at the site. But a huge step was obviously taken in 2003 when the last plutonium metal was removed from the site. That was a major milestone in the history of the Department of Energy and in the cleanup of its sites.
This is Rocky Flats is going to be the first one that's completed, right? The first.
I'm not sure. Rocky Flats is certainly the biggest one to have been completed. There are several. Unfortunately, the government contaminated lots of places during World War II.
Yeah.
Rocky Flats was simply one of the major nodes. So a variety of other places in the country have been successfully cleaned up and had their nuclear materials removed. But Rocky Flats is certainly the biggest one and probably the most notable one to date.
Now, I have heard some, especially from workers at the plant that I've interviewed, I have heard some complaints or fears that this new sort of performance-based system is that they're working towards these benchmarks, and that they don't think that they're doing it. You know, there's an incentive to get it done so quickly that there aren't proper safeguards being taken.
Yeah. Well, I think the issue of safety in these performance contracts is significant, and I know that the department has continued to work to try to make sure that safety's in the forefront of what they're doing while still getting work done. I mean, I think everybody can see. Nobody wants an outcome like the Challenger disaster, where you had a philosophy of faster, better, cheaper, but where people who had safety concerns for a variety of reasons didn't feel like they were able to speak up. I really don't know where the site is at this point from that perspective. It certainly doesn't surprise me that that would be a concern of the workers, and I think it's up to the department and to the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, which oversees them, to make sure that safety is always at the forefront of what gets done.
Okay. I wonder if you could just tell me some of the challenges. I talked to my dad earlier today and asked him just to tell me specific questions that I should ask you, and he mentioned there were some problems with as they started decommissioning. Some of the difficulties were things they found that they didn't know existed. He also mentioned issues with whistleblowers, and then problems with the security force. So I'm wondering if you could tell me some of the roadblocks along
Sure.
the way to closure that you.
Sure. Well, I mean, the technical challenges are large enough, but the managerial challenges ultimately end up being the ones that are the hardest. I mean, the ones that involve how one deals with people effectively. There were clearly, and I think they're gone, but again, I haven't been on the campus, so to speak, for several years now, so this is hearsay. But what I know is that there were several rooms that were so contaminated that literally for a good long time workers couldn't go in them. Well, if you can't go in them, how are you going to be able to clean them up? So figuring that problem out, how to use technology. Some of it was remote technology, remote sensing kind of technology, and robotic technology to get materials out of places was definitely a challenge at first. There were all kinds of electrical problems that were encountered, and they had a fire at Rocky Flats, so the intersection of electricity with radioactive materials hanging around was always interesting. I think on the worker side, there was a guard strike in November '94. I mean, this was a period of time that perhaps even seems quaint now, given our post-September 11th environment. But in this period of time, we were trying to draw down the security forces at Rocky Flats as the footprint of the plant began to change. We didn't need as many people, or at least we perceived we didn't need as many people. So we started to take steps to reduce the number of guards, gates, and guns that were at the facility. And basically the union leader at that time of the guards, who I can't remember his name, thankfully, basically said he was going to strike on Election Day in Colorado and was going to make this try to make it a large political issue. Unfortunately, he said that too far in advance of Election Day, and we were able to prepare for it, and were able to bring in other people from the outside, and I think there was an underestimation of the determination that we had and the support that we had from the Colorado political community to change Rocky Flats and to make this, to clean this place up and get out and not have it turn into a 25-year project where 10,000 people had jobs from now to forever. I mean, our job was to try to transition the workforce, but ultimately to get into the decontamination and decommissioning of this place so that not as many of the nation's resources were being used here. I mean, we were using more resources on this environmental program than the entire Environmental Protection Agency, or the Food and Drug Administration, or the FBI had. I mean, this is just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this program. I mean, it's one of the larger discretionary expenditures that the United States makes at this point. And there were a lot of people in the political community here in Washington who wanted to see that shrink.
This was the entire environmental...
Yeah, the DOE Environmental Management Program, of which Rocky Flats was about a tenth, about $600 million out of, during the time that I was there at least, out of about $6 billion, was, that was the complete size of the program. Well, even $600 million a year for a place as relatively small as Rocky Flats was not understood by people in the Washington political community, Washington, D.C. political community. Mm-hmm. I mean, how could something cost this much money? Well, I think unless you understand kind of what it takes to do work in a nuclear environment and not hurt people, it is difficult to understand that. And but one of the things we had to do was to try to reduce the labor force, whether it was the guards, gates, and guns, or the other parts of the labor force, really pretty much as much as we could in as short as time as we could. So the security guards were the first people to try to call our bluff on this, and I think there was an expectation that in a Democratic administration they would be successful, and they weren't. One of the other big challenges I recall were, records, medical records, because there were so many people who had worked at Rocky Flats from the end of World War II till the 1990s. A lot of people had gone through the place because they were in such close proximity to, very highly toxic materials, let alone the radiation. There was always a very heavy concern about whether there would be long-term health effects from exposure. And we got ourselves into a situation at one point where we literally, I think, couldn't find, because they had accumulated over the years, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of documents that a federal judge in Denver gave us an incredibly short time period to put together, and we ended up hiring what seemed like a bazillion people out of the cleanup funds to actually find records, and for a while that was money that was being taken away from the actual cleanup at the plant.
Was this when you were held in contempt, or the
Yes.
was held in contempt?
Yes, I was never held in contempt of court personally. I don't even know. I guess we were held in contempt, or at least show cause why we shouldn't be held in contempt. And yeah, so we had to do, you know, a long and painful fire drill with records to get it together so that, you know, the court, the case, this lawsuit could kind of go forward in a reasonable way. And, you know, that was very painful because I think it was costing us, something like $1 million a week to collect all these records. Well, that starts to add up, and was another one of the painful experiences at Rocky Flats. But I have to tell you, mostly from my perspective, while Rocky Flats was a mess, it went better than most of the other sites that I had to deal with because we actually had quality, good people. We had an advisory committee that actually functioned pretty well with citizens, people who were interested in moving things ahead. Yeah, they had all kinds of questions about, you know, how safe is safe and what residual levels were there going to be and problems that existed. But they were, I mean, they're pretty much all reasonable problems that were brought up. And the resolution of them was approached by the local political communities, I thought almost always in a way where we could have an opportunity to solve problems rather than just get into, you know, eternal arguments with people who would never be satisfied.
Why do you think this was different from the other sites?
Well, I think the main reason why it's different is because there really is not anywhere near the incentive for people to hang on to the Department of Energy in Colorado and at Rocky Flats in particular, as there is in other parts of the country. I mean, because Rocky Flats is in an urban area, in that time, and hopefully again, and in an area where the economy builds other jobs and other things, there's more of an opportunity for people to get work and other things. So you don't have the same degree of antagonism as exists in some other places around the country. And in the political community in Colorado, the congressmen, governors, the senators have all been very supportive of the department moving as quickly as it could to actually clean up this place. I mean, and without the support of the political community, you can't do anything in this. So it's the combination of the urbanized nature of the area, which probably also led to the support of the political community, which has enabled things to continue to move forward at Rocky Flats.
So the political community was more supportive of mission change at Rocky Flats and in other places.
Yeah, and I would say not only mission change, but mission termination. I mean, the Governor Romer came to my office shortly after, which was very unusual to have the sitting governor of a major state in these United States come to some lowly bureaucrat's office in Washington. He came to my office I can remember it, on a sunny winter's morning and basically said, "We want you guys out of here as quickly as we can, and you can count on me to help you do that. Now, you know, I want it done safely. I don't want corners cut on this, but if you move, I will support you to take the steps that are necessary to make this happen." And he was a man of his word. Anytime there was a problem, he stepped in. He would mediate it. He would try constructively to help us work things out, whether it was with the state government, other parts of the state government, whether it was with the political community, whether it was with the neighbors. And I think the last thing that helped at Rocky Flats a lot is because there were a fair number of people who lived around Rocky and who didn't work there, that they didn't have the same, they had much higher incentive to say, we'd really like you guys to get out of here. And I think all of that tended to work. Plus it was, after the Cold War, everybody knew the place didn't have a mission at that place. It was old, decrepit. In any kind of commercial environment, Rocky Flats would have been closed 20 years sooner. So, anybody who knew anything knew it was time for us to leave this place.
So in other sites, the communities, the oversight groups would tend to be more members of the community who didn't want to let this sort of economic lifeblood go, rather than, my experience with most of the oversight people were environmentalists and scientists who didn't want it around. So that was very different composition than in other locales.
Yeah, fairly dramatically. I mean, and there's always stated agendas and then unstated agendas. And I don't think one has to be a cynic in life to understand that people don't always put all their interests on the table every day. And without naming names, at a variety of DOE sites, not everyone, but at a variety of DOE sites, there's just there's no other major economic engine in the vicinity. I mean, if the government leaves with its $1 billion a year in spending at some of these places, there are going to be difficult economic circumstances, and the reality of that just alters the tone of the conversation. I mean, you can be having a conversation with somebody that's ostensibly about safety and health, but which everybody knows is really about employment. Because normally it involves, we need to have more people who are inspectors, or more of this, or more of that, or more of the other. And while, there's often kind of a kernel of a good point in those conversations, kind of sorting through the chaff to get to the wheat is harder in other places than it is at Rocky Flats, I think.
So the tenor would be at Rocky Flats might be, get out of here, we don't want you, do what you need to do to clean up, versus hire more people to
in general
watch over the waste. Or
yes, in general I would say that's the case. I mean, not universally. I mean, we can find certainly groups of whether they be workers or other people who, for a variety of reasons, either want to see the mission come back, or don't feel like they have opportunities that are as good as the opportunities that exist with the DOE in terms of pay. There are pockets of that. There are pockets of resistance to change about almost anything you can think of. And I'm not saying there aren't some legitimate reasons for people to say, you can't leave yet, you haven't finished the job. I mean, there are legitimate issues, and I think as we get closer to the end, this tends, for better or for worse, tends to be like water running down a drain. And people start to pick up momentum. Hey, we want to go. We want to get out of here. So I think the next couple of years actually are going to be very interesting and tough ones, in which there does need to be continued serious work and oversight by people to make sure that that the things are being done according to Hoyle, because there will be an impetus to say, okay, we're done, let's go, when we may not be done yet. And then, of course, the whole stewardship issue of long-term stewardship of the land is, I think it's an interesting issue that we haven't totally solved yet.
in what way?
I don't think that we have we have the right offices set up now. There are things called Office of Legacy Management in the DOE. So the right sort of bureaucratic names are in place, but actually having thought through, well, how are we actually going to have a continuing presence that is meaningful and a continuing relook to make sure that things don't deteriorate, or that 25 years from now we don't find something, or more likely, what are we going to do when 25 years from now we do find something that either we didn't know was there or thought had been removed? What's going to be the process for dealing with that? Ideally, what's going to be the process 25 years from now when people have forgotten all about Rocky Flats as an entity, and somebody says, well, this looks like a pretty good site for housing development. Making sure we have the right land restrictions in place, the right deed restrictions, making sure they're enforced, making sure that as Denver expands, the Denver Boulder area, Golden expands, that you don't have, inordinate economic pressures placed to change land use decisions that were made in the first part of the 21st century when, it's like, well, what's everybody so worried about 25 or 30 years from now? I think those are important issues to think about for our kids, for our, for people who aren't even born yet.
All right. You had mentioned, we discussed the oversight groups. I understand that you may have taken a different approach to the oversight groups than previous administrations.
Well, I actually had and have the belief, and this may sound naive, but that a well-educated citizenry and people who can actually participate seriously in making site decisions. I think it's not easy. I think it requires a ton of information provision on the part of the government. I think it requires people to hold their tongues, who may in fact know better, but a lot of the people who work for the DOE are very smart engineering people who know a lot. And it's often difficult for people who are well trained technically to relax and let somebody talk to them about problems that the other person's not really an expert in but has legitimate concerns about. And I think what we tried to do at Rocky Flats and at some of the other sites, and we're pretty successful at Rocky Flats, and even maybe more successful at places like Fernald and Ohio, but quite successful at Rocky Flats, is in fact getting to the point where at least some of the people who were on the advisory forums actually believed, rightly so in my mind, that they actually had something to say about what happened there. And my own feeling is once you can get people to that place where they actually feel like they're part of the decision-making process, the vast majority of people will understand that life's full of trade-offs, that you can't maximize everything all the time, and that you have to make some choices. And having, smart, committed people helping you make choices is better than trying to do it in a black hole.
And previous administrations or previous people in your position, what did they do?
Well, I think there's a tendency in every technically based program, again, to take what I would call the expert perspective on things, which is, hey, we're trained in nuclear engineering, we know best, just trust us. We're not going to hurt you. We're upstanding citizens, and we're trained in this. Get out of the way, let us do our job. And I think that there are a lot of cases where that has to be the case, where that has to be true. You don't let somebody who doesn't know anything about radiation just wander into a room that's filled with plutonium. There are some places where the experts have to rule. We're not going to impanel a band of citizens to say, oh, by the way, what's the best engineering approach to building a new bridge? We actually want it to work. But we would ask citizens the question, where do you think the bridge ought to be built? All things being equal, if we have several choices, So yeah, I think that previous administrations, I think not because of any partisan political concern, but more because there's just there's just plenty of evidence of not in my backyard kind of decision making, that it's kind of the natural thing to do to just want to do it yourself. The unnatural thing to do is to let go a little bit and let other people help you make the decision.
I wonder if you could just, sounds like you visited the campus or the site a number of times. Tell me your impressions of it
Yeah.
and just sort of.
Well, briefly, I was shocked the first time I went there. I wasn't prepared for how cluttered, old, and dirty it was. I mean, when I stepped into the place for the first time, I realized what a tremendous challenge we had to clean this place up. So that was the first thing. Secondly, being in a manufacturing plant for the most highly explosive material in the world just kind of generally gives one pause. Watching the guys with the gloves and manipulating the cans of plutonium, and I mean, it was. I had been to other places by that time, but I think you can't really appreciate the Manhattan Project and what happened in the United States in the beginning of the 1940s unless you've seen one of these places. I mean, it's a major chapter in world history. So you feel some of that. I also felt very strongly the discontent and disheartenment of the people who were working there at that time. This is about 4 years after both the FBI raid and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and most of the employees, people who worked there, were like thoroughly disillusioned by this point. One, they saw that their mission in some ways was over and had mixed feelings about that. I mean, as citizens, I think, like most of us, people were pleased that we weren't necessarily living 1 minute to midnight anymore. But, the people who worked at Rocky Flats were so proud of the work that they had done, and had done in all kinds of difficult environments, under very tough schedules. In their hearts, they really believed that they won the Cold War, that their production of this material and the fact that it never had to be used, was significant, very significant. And then all of a sudden one day somebody comes in and says, well, we don't care what you do anymore. I think that was just very hard on people. And then, as I indicated earlier, they got into this environment where it became very, very tough to do any work because the safety envelope, to use the term of art that's out there, just wasn't big enough to permit a lot of work to be done. So you had a lot of people standing around, not doing very much. Well, I don't think most Americans like standing around on their jobs. Maybe there are some, and maybe we all like it for a day or two every once in a while as a relief from from what we do. But I don't think that most people who get up and go to work in the morning want to do nothing. They want to feel like they're contributing to something in their lives, and I think a lot of those people didn't feel that. And I just felt that palpably the first time I went out there. So, you know, the combination of a demoralized workforce, a place that was not very pretty to look at or be around, and the inherent dangers of the place made Rocky Flats kind of an intimidating place to be in 1993 and early 1994. And boy, my hat's off to all the people who worked at the site, from the, you know, just everybody who was there, from the blue collar folks to the people who actually worked in this, to the contractor folks, to the DOE folks. Took a little while to hook in, but my impression is that more than most places, these people sort of picked up their shoes and their socks and went to work. And it's not perfect, and I'm sure there's still problems there, but you know that something's been a success when you meet a lot of people on the street who now say, oh yeah, I worked at Rocky Flats, I worked on the cleanup. It's like there's a lot of people now who they may not be as proud of that as they were when they were working on the stuff during the Cold War, but there are a number of people who think they've done a pretty good job.
It sounds like you came out of the environmental community to some extent. Did your perception of these people who are sort of in the trenches of the Cold War change when you went in, saw where they worked, and got to know them? I mean, did you?
Well, some, I think. I mean, I have to say, I never, I mean, just personally, I mean, I never dishonor work. And, you know, I come from a family where, you know, my grandfathers one was a milkman and the other was a plumber, so blue collar work is something that my family is used to as important. So no, I never felt that what they were doing was dishonorable in any way, shape, or form. I felt pretty strongly that a lot of people had to get their minds right about what the challenges were now. And I spent a lot of time over 4 years trying to persuade people that the technical and managerial challenges in getting this stuff cleaned up were just as great as the ones in creating this in the first place. That this was not, you know, scut work or knuckle dragger work. This was important work for the future of the country. And not only that, represented a fulfillment of the commitment that the government of the United States makes to people, that says it's going to do what it does in a safe fashion. And, you know, for 30 years, the government wasn't responsible for the same environmental laws as everybody else was. And then that all changed in '86, and it was like, hey, let's get with the program. And I admit, I was not very sympathetic to people who moaned and groaned about, gee, we have to be in compliance with the law. It's like, well, who doesn't have to be in compliance with the law? You know, get with the program. Well, but that's not us anymore. This is 7 years later. Let's get with the program.
That was the Federal Facilities Compliance Act? Is that what happened in '86?
No, what happened in '86 was there was a Supreme Court decision that made it clear that federal facilities were, the Congress intended that federal facilities be regulated under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And then the Federal Facilities Acts came along later to kind of codify and reaffirm that you know, the government now had the same responsibilities as everybody else. But, you know, it wasn't like, we weren't there in '87. I mean, we were there in '93, '94. And, you know, it was like, well, if you're, you know, stop groaning about this. This is just how it is. I mean, we can argue about how much money we should spend and what actually constitutes compliance. I mean, there's lots of, you know, important and not always easy technical questions around issues of what should be done. But, you know, I just would basically blow people off when they would start moaning and groaning about how we have to do all this. So I would say that, you know, my main feeling about the people was that they were engaged in an honorable mission, and the mission was at that point pretty much done, and we had this job to do, and hey, let's get with it.
When you do go onto the site, did you go and did you have to put on the
Oh yeah,
smock
of
and-
course I did. Yeah.
Could you describe sort of what you did and what you saw, like what the rooms look like a little bit, just since they're all
Oh,
going to be
goodness.
gone very soon?
Yeah. Well, the rooms were like, well, first of all, because Rocky Flats at that point had material which could be directly put in a weapon, not just made into a weapon. I mean, we had the shapes there. So the closer you got to the facility itself, the more people with serious weapons you saw. So when I was talking before about guns, gates, and guards, I mean, we're talking out at the outer reaches. I mean, our strategy always was, and it's the same one that gets applied today, is the closer you get to the secure area, the more security there is. You may not see it all the time, but at Rocky Flats, part of the strategy was too, is make sure people see those big bad weapons that you have. Well, I don't know. I mean, as someone who's, I just was never used to being close up to, M16s and serious weapons. So the first thing that you sort of encounter is that kind of security environment that's there. And then, before you even go in, I mean, you do a radiation test before you even get inside the turnstiles to the place. As soon as you go in the turnstile, you go into this room, and you've got to basically, you got to put on completely cover your body, so that it's not exposed to radiation. Got fitted for a respirator. Put on a respirator with a face mask covering everything, and then we walked into the part of the plant where they were trying to recondition some of the old, what they called cans. I mean, really cans worth of plutonium. This is difficult to convey, I think, to your average citizen, but the material is lined up in cans on a kind of an assembly line inside what are called glove boxes, where people can sort of stick their hands and arms in to completely hermetically sealed containers that enable them to manipulate through the plastic gloves or whatever they were made of. I'm not sure what they were made of. These were very hot, small rooms where everybody who was in it was dressed like the guys in E.T., who, came to get the alien. And so you feel very much like you're in an alien environment. And yet, on the other hand, they could be dealing with grapefruits in there. Because you don't have any sense, as long as you're following the procedures and as long as there's no emergency bells ringing, you don't have as good a sense of the radiation or the potential for toxic contamination. I mean, you know it because you're covered with all this stuff, but people are going about their business working as though they were working on foodstuffs as opposed to plutonium. And I found that kind of juxtaposition always very interesting. But and then part of your mind, you're just hoping that nothing bad happens while you're there.
I'm going to stop you.
Yeah.
Because we're at an hour.